Okay, my name is Dr. Blumenthal. I am the Director of Trauma Crisis Intervention for Ohel Children's Home and Family Services. And this presentation is in conjunction with the New York Community Hospital. I want to personally thank Barry Stern for all his efforts in terms of orchestrating this and organizing it. Just for the sake to make things clear or to make it audible, I have muted everybody. As the host, I can do that. However, you can unmute yourself. So if at any point you feel you need to say something, you have that option of on probably in the bottom left corner of your screen if you're using a computer, or probably a comparable site on your phone. You can unmute yourself if you want to say something. It's a manageable crowd, so we could probably have people interrupting, asking questions, etc. But then I ask you to mute yourself again afterwards. So again, background noise will not be disturbing to everybody. If you want to just comment or direct a question, there is a chat option. Again, on the computer on the bottom, or also I'm sure in your phone there may be also a chat option. I generally use a computer, I don't use a phone, so I'm a little more familiar with the computer. So you can ask a question privately as well. You can direct it to the host, I am the host, or you can direct it to everybody if you just want to comment, or if you want to direct a question without speaking, you can use that chat option. And if I see that questions are coming up in the chat, I might stop for a minute and check them out. I'm going to be speaking for about a half hour to 40 minutes about the topic, and I'm going to leave about 20 minutes for comments or questions that people have. So if you do have a particular question and you don't want to interrupt in the middle, please feel free to wait towards the end, and at that point we'll have the opportunity for people to raise issues or ask questions. This session is being recorded, although we will not record necessarily comments and questions. So if you don't want to have your comments or questions recorded, we can have those removed. But the bulk of the presentation will be recorded and will be made available to the entire staff. So in case you know of a colleague, or you yourself may have to leave early or came late, know that there'll be a recording available of this discussion, so the material will be made available to you. The topic is stress and dealing with the stress, grief, and loss of the stress and the grief of the coronavirus crisis. And so what I'm going to be focusing on is the nature of the stress that people are experiencing, particularly health workers. I'm going to be focused on that. What we can do. This is not going to be just hand-wringing. I'm going to try to give some advice, and we've been doing a lot of this, so we have some feedback, etc. So we know what seems to be working for people. So we're going to give advice, and again, what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for the other. So it's a little bit of a menu. You'll pick out which seems to make sense for you. And I'm also going to talk. I understand tragically that there has been a loss among staff, and I know families, probably many of whom have experienced the loss of relatives, of friends, and or have friends and relatives who are hospitalized at the time or at grave risk. And therefore, I'm going to try to address that issue as well. I'm available, and I'll make that clear at the end as well. I and the Ohel trauma team are available people. Sometimes people have somewhat more individual situations, and certainly make ourselves available. And again, Barry Stern can also be a conduit to get anybody in touch with me or members of our staff if they need more specific assistance. Now let's talk about the stress and the grief and what we can do during this coronavirus crisis. Now, first of all, let's face it, this is a reality. And something I'm sure all of us, unless, or maybe say most of us, have not experienced anything comparable. This is a real bona fide crisis, it's a real bona fide threat to ourselves individually, to our families, and to the community at large. And therefore, it makes it a little bit of tricky because, as I said, we've never really had this before, I don't think in our respective lifetimes. And except maybe an individual might have some sort of situation. And it's very hard to find that happy medium because we're naturally stressed. And as I'm going to explain shortly, stress is not, and anxiety is not necessarily a bad state, especially in these conditions. So let me give you maybe an extreme example. Before there was the coronavirus, and life was pretty regular with the regular challenges, etc. And you have a normal, regular day with some things that bother you, some things that are less than optimal, but for the most part, things are going well, and you're terribly nervous and you're terribly anxious. Something would be wrong. Something, but we'd say you have maybe an anxiety disorder or something, because your anxiety and worry is disproportionate with the reality of the circumstances that you're in. But if you are a soldier in a war zone and you are highly anxious and alert and feel the stress and pressure of knowing that you're on guard duty, you might be shot at, that's healthy because you're in danger. And anxiety and stress is a response to a threat. And if you're in a threatening situation, you need to be anxious. In fact, as I'm going to speak about shortly, there's a problem sometimes when people are not anxious enough. So we're again in a highly threatening situation. And those of you doing healthcare, and again, you are really one of several heroes in this saga, but you're actually putting yourself you're on the front. You're like the soldier. You're putting yourself in a dangerous situation in order to care and treat others. And therefore, a certain amount of worry and concern and anxiety is highly warranted at this time. So how do we find that happy medium? You don't want to have too much and you don't want to have too little. So, and by the way, so as I said, you can have too little anxiety. But to some extent, having an element of anxiety is indicated at this time. And this becomes kind of important at this juncture, because it's interesting that there's sort of been a progression in terms of a response to this crisis. Initially, most of us were shocked, and when the quarantine, or the varying degrees of quarantine, was imposed upon us, and again, also in the hospital facility, as you were flooded with cases like this, we were all in high alert, and we were all frantically trying to find a way to cope, and frantically trying to maintain our prior connections and lifestyle. We were busy communicating and connecting, etc. And we really very much treated this as if this is some sort of aberrant event, some sort of out of the ordinary event, which we're very hopeful would end soon. It's been several weeks now, and many of us have been sort of lulled into a sort of acceptance of this. It's become, if you will, over our last few weeks, it's become our routine. It's become sort of a norm. And this we've seen from the phone calls we're getting and from the cases we're handling has had a sort of double effect. On one hand, we have some people who are really getting restless, and there are, we have different levels of restlessness or different levels of sort of calmness we all have. And there are some of us, again, not anything extreme, we're not diagnosing, but some of us who are prone to more restlessness, who need to get out and need more stimulation, others who can sort of chill more and stay home longer. And those among us, and I mean the general population, who might have a need for more activity, you might have a need for more stimulation, or might have greater restlessness when confined to our homes, are really starting now to get restless and starting even sometimes to take chances, are starting to question, or for that matter, even breach the sort of communal or the government-sanctioned standards in order to get out there and be stimulated and busy. So there's that issue coming up. But the other issue that's coming up is because we're getting used to it. Sometimes when we get used to it, in a way that's good, because the risks and the pressure of a quarantine or working in a health facility are great. As we get into a routine, as it becomes more normal, it becomes less stressful. But on the other hand, then sometimes we get lazy. Sometimes we get careless because we're not thinking that much. We're not in that hyper alert state. So as I said, we can have too little anxiety. And unfortunately, we have seen this. We have seen people who are not taking this seriously enough, and for that, or because it's been already a few weeks, are sort of cutting corners and maybe taking risks that are jeopardizing their well-being, the well-being of all the people around them as well. And those people have to be sort of made more anxious. Those people need more stress. It's not not dissimilar to what we see in schools, studies on test anxiety, students who take tests, show that a child can have too much anxiety, in which case they're not thinking straight and don't do well on the test. They can have too little anxiety, which means they don't care. They're dismissive, they don't study, they don't try hard, and then they don't do well either. It's similar in our situation now. We need that medium level of anxiety. So those who are finding themselves now not so careful with protective gear, not so careful with washing, or for those who are maybe taking chances in terms of defying the standards of social distancing, may need, if it's a family member or a friend or yourself, you may need to remind yourself of the dangers. You may need to make yourself more anxious. More often, what we're seeing is actually too much anxiety. We're seeing people who are starting to call us and say they can't take it anymore. They're wrecked. They're not sleeping. They're short-tempered with people around them. The anxiety is getting to be too much. Now, what people are more at risk for too much anxiety, and what we can do is as follows. First of all, anyone who has had a pre-existing condition, anxiety disorder, or a tendency towards anxiety, or maybe a family history of anxiety, because again, these things tend to run in families. They are more at risk now when there is actually a real threat around us to have an overwrought kind of reaction. It could be some people may have had a history of various types of trauma, or maybe a history of devastating disease, maybe potentially fatal disease, and that will also cause too much anxiety. It is also possible that there's cumulative anxiety. There are many different sources of the anxiety sort of piling up one on the other. It may be that somebody has might have had financial complications before all this happened. Or maybe somebody had other kind of medical ailments that they were dealing with, or other types of stress. There may have been relationship issues, divorces, or something of that sort. And a stressor coming on the heels of another stressor grows exponentially. In other words, if, let's say, I gave one stress a value of 2, and then another stress came along concurrently and it also has a value of 2, 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4. 2 plus 2 equals 8, because stress on the heels of stress grow exponentially. So many of the people who may be experiencing such high levels of stress, it's again growing exponentially. Now, again, if I relate it to the work that most of you or all of you are doing, that's relevant, because you not only have the stress of worrying about your own health, worrying about your home, managing children who are suddenly home from school, and the whole homeschooling thing. On top of that, you have the pressure and the stress of the work and attending to people who are ill during a time of a pandemic. And those two stresses combined can be really grow huge, can sort of loom very large, and can create that type of anxiety. Now, one more thing I think is important to understand in terms of these kind of anxious reactions is that they tend to come in waves, and sometimes they hit you unexpected. In other words, those who are experiencing, let's say, more anxiety than is even warranted in the current situation, they'll have good days and bad days. They'll have good hours, bad hours. You might feel like you have everything under control, and in the middle of the night, wake up and break out in a cold sweat. That is the nature of anxiety reactions. We can't stay in that kind of heightened state all the time. So it tends to hit us in bite-sized portions. It tends to hit us sort of piecemeal. And that may be happening to some of you. As I said, that you're Monday, things seem pretty good. Let's say even Monday, Tuesday, things seem pretty good. And you feel like now you have things under control. And then Wednesday, you feel like you're falling apart. In fact, sometimes, especially for, again, people like you who are manning the front in terms of healthcare and who are busy during the day, seeing devastation, illness, a lot of pressure to get, to attend to patients in facilities that are often overextended. While you're working, it's not going to hit you because you're going to be busy focusing on what you have to do. And then later when you get home, ironically, and then when you can really sort of like take off all that protective gear, settle down in your house, have maybe, I know you're working shifts, so you might have a day off. You figure, okay, now I can catch my breath. Then sometimes all the anxiety and pressure of the work that you're doing will suddenly come cascading into you and will hit you sort of like a tsunami. So it's kind of ironic that while you're in the situation that's causing the stress, you may not experience it, and then it might hit you later. So what are some of the things that you can do? And again, we can't make this good. We can't, I mean, hopefully this will end soon, and when it does, we'll get back to our prior levels of equanimity and calm. But while this is going on, we are all in this sort of heightened state of alertness. So what can you do to make sure it doesn't become over too much? So most important, I think, and what I'm going to emphasize the most is outlets. And outlets take on many different forms, but there's never been a time where it's been more important that you very deliberately give yourself the opportunity to have ways to different types of activities that are known and proven to reduce levels of anxiety. Perhaps number one on top of it all is exercise. And exercise doesn't mean that you have to train for the Olympics. Exercise means some physical outlet. It can include just calisthenics at home, watching a video of different types of exercise. It could be walks. It could be, if you're up to it, a run, or I don't know if there's up now with social distancing, if ball playing is an option. But maybe if you have a setting where you can play the ball yourself without competing with, or just within the family of members, if you can do that, that would be fine. It could be yoga, it could be different types of, more light physical activities. But we know that exercise has a calming effect, that the brain secretes endorphins, and that after a good workout, or even a moderate workout, one feels more relaxed. And this has to be part of it. It could be dance. I mean, many of us have seen the videos. For all I know, it came from New York Community Hospital, of staff, hospital staff in full gear during a break, doing some sort of dance together, some sort of scripted physical activity. But these are extremely important. And again, you might say, well, I'm not in shape, and I'm not, I'm not an athlete. As I said, it could be a brief walk. It could be a 15-minute walk. Obviously, hopefully someplace where there aren't too many people, or again with protective gear if it's in a more congested area. But these are that's one of the most important. But again, if physical activity is not your choice, if you will, the many others. There can be other kind of hobbies. There can be woodworking. It could be art. It could be music, whether it's listening to music or playing music, which again clearly has a soothing effect. And even can be meditative types of activities, whether it's actual meditation, or as I said, or like yoga, or just visualizations, soothing visualizations or something like that, or even spiritual pursuits, if it suits you culturally and personally. Prayer, study, religious study. Again, what that does is sort of removes you temporarily from the surroundings we're in to a greater realm. And again, psychologically, I'm not talking about this as in any kind of preacher or clergy, that is known to have a soothing effect. Now, there are certain activities that we might have turned to in the past, and that are not necessarily constructive. And I should mention those as well. And we all have them. First of all, I'm going to talk about a little bit about watching TV, movies or videos, or playing video games. They are relaxing. And certainly while you're engaged in activity, you're sort of in almost an hypnotic state because they're so stimulating. But you have to be careful if the show you're watching, or if the game you're watching is a very frenetic one, or it has a lot of violence and activity, because even though while you're watching it, you're being entertained, sometimes there's a residual effect and you can be sort of more agitated afterwards. So if you're not terribly anxious and you enjoy those kind of games or movies, so be it, but that's fine. But if you're looking for something that's more soothing and you want to use that medium, you should really be watching something that by nature is more relaxing, more serene, even a game that might be more challenging cognitively or might be imaginative, but doesn't involve cars racing and shooting and things like that, because that may be calming while you're in it, but afterwards can have sort of residual tense effect. And again, this is all based on what we know from research, but there are other types of activities that we all have, and I'm talking to everyone, that we may have used or resorted to in the past that are contraindicated at this point. This could be eating, emotional eating, overeating. If that's your Achilles heel, if that's what your fault, what you go, I mean, we're all gaining weight, and there are a lot of jokes about it as well, because we are less anxious. But I mean, if there's excessive eating, that can be counterproductive. If alcohol consumption or prescription drugs or even illicit drugs, if that's part of your history and that's what you've turned to calm down, you have to be careful about it. It could be temper outbursts. It could be something, and we all have them. Again, I want to say, I'm not saying this is something, I'm not addressing myself to any group. We all have these, and we have to, a lot of this is self-awareness, and we have to know ourselves. We have to know what works for us and what we might resort to in the past that would be contraindicated, and we have to know that even better now as we're facing the levels of stress. Another thing that, again, is very important, and some people treat it with a little bit sort of sarcasm, but I think it has to be mentioned, and that's self-praise, or allowing other people, taking in the praise and the adoration that you get from other people. Again, as I've mentioned, you are heroes, and what you're doing is remarkable, and you're unsung heroes because you're not getting headlines and people aren't writing ballads about you, but you're really out there saving lives. And this, I'm not saying this just as gratuitous or just for flattery's sake. We need this, especially when we're stressed, and especially if we see it, if you're surrounded, if you're on a unit or whatever, or you're working a part of the hospital where you see a lot of death and devastation, you have to remind yourself of the good work you're doing. And you have to very deliberately do that. Or for that matter, when there are those, and I'm sure they're insufficient, but when there are those opportunities where people accord you the praise you deserve, whether it's people applauding or just sending cards or just even speaking to you, take it in, because you need that, and it'll balance some of the pressure and some of the frustration from the harm and even the death that you're seeing. Another thing that's not emphasized enough, but is incredibly important, if you're feeling a great deal of stress from your work or just from what's going on around you, or from what might be happening, hopefully not, but what might be happening in your own personal family, is talk it out. And this is extremely important. When I mean talk it out, I don't mean because the person who's listening to you, and I mean it should be interpersonal, it should be with someone else, or the person that can be remote, but the person who's listening to you has solutions. Because very few of us, there's more problems than solutions in the situation we're living in right now, as we all know. But the very process of talking about it, just the process of putting the stress into words is already calming. And we see this again and again in many, I don't want to make this a psychology lecture in psych studies, but we have seen this again and again, even, by the way, anatomically. There are studies that show that if somebody had been through a traumatic or horrific situation, and you can watch the brain nowadays with MRIs and PET scans, we can watch the brain. And if we ask the person to remember it, the part of the brain that is stimulated, the part of the brain that sort of is aroused, is usually a very primitive part of the brain, deep in the brain stem, the part of the brain that we share with the animal kingdom, which is all fears and emotion, etc. But then if you say to the person, now tell me what happened, and it could be anything. It could be a stressful day. It could be a veteran coming back from Afghanistan or something like that. But yes, and now tell me in words what happened. As they talk about it, you can literally see it shift in the brain to the frontal cortex, to the part of the brain that makes that we don't share with the animal kingdom, the part of the brain that governs logic and thinking. And it becomes more manageable. And this is important to know, not only for yourself in terms of communicating with other people, but it's extremely important to know if you happen to be the one listening. If you are the one whom your coworker or your family member came to talk about what they're going through, you don't have to give them solutions. If you have one, if you have a suggestion, by all means do so. But if you do nothing else but listen, and attentively listen, show the person you're listening, show the person from your facial expressions, from your body language, that you're fully attentive to what they're telling you, they'll feel better. In fact, I can tell you that even in my work, people calling with stress, issues of stress, etc., that sometimes when people come to me with issues and I basically listen, that they actually feel better afterwards. And even if I say nothing, and even as a professional, sometimes that takes some getting used to on my part. I'm just going to stop for a second. It seems to be a problem with the camera. Let me just stop it and restart it and see if that makes a difference. Now there's a light there. I'm sorry, I apologize about that. There seems to be some sort of, hold on a second. Yeah, okay, some sort of disturbance with the light. I'm sorry. Okay, the next, okay. Now the other thing, by the way, to know about also, and then again, I do want to spend some time addressing what should be done. Another thing that you have to be aware of is that whatever was will be more. And that goes, as I said, for conditions. If you have a tendency towards anxiety, in a situation like this, there'll be greater anxiety. And that's also true, by the way, of relationships. That if there are relationship issues in your life, those issues can be worse during a crisis situation. That can go for home, and that can go for for work as well. Now, I'm not talking about anything extreme. I'm not talking about any kind of violence or any kind of abuse or something like that. But areas, we all have them. Areas of relationships between partners, between parents and children, between friends, even although we're socially distanced from friends. But that may have been problematic but manageable before this. Now, because of the stress, may be experienced as overwhelming. So let's say it's a marriage or a partnership or a relationship, and it's a good one, and it's functional, but there are little areas, there's some things that were at times more manageable. You probably could have worked it out between yourselves, or maybe even gotten some professional help and worked them out. Now they're going to feel more painful. It's almost like that old expression of standing on someone's ingrown toenail. It's going to hurt more. And the same thing is true, by the way, at work. That, again, not major conflict like that, but there's always, in every work setting, there's politics. There's having to work with people whose maybe style of working is one that doesn't suit you. And it's, as I said, it may have bothered you. It might be something you'd moan and groan about. You might come home and complain about it, but you can handle it. Now, with the stress going on, it's going to be exacerbated. It's going to feel worse. Now, while we're in a crisis, and we are in a crisis right now, we're not solving problems. We're not, in other words, let's even say it's a relationship matter, even at work. Let's even say it's some political issue. Between certain co-workers, or between a worker and their supervisor, and that person's supervisor. And it could be worked out. Maybe some help from people in HR, or maybe whatever could be worked out. We're not solving problems now. Right now, we're parking problems, because we're so consumed by trying, especially for those of you, again, in healthcare, you're so consumed by attending to the needs of patients, and we're so consumed by trying to ensure our own safety and health, and even our mental health, that we don't really have, for the most part, the mental energy or reserve to address now problems. So we're parking problems, and that's what we're recommending. So now's not the time to address these issues. Or it could be even with children that are home, and are they attending to their homeschooling? Are they not attending to their homeschooling? Are kids fighting with each other more? We're gonna do Band-Aids. We're going to take stopgate measures to make it manageable. And when all this is over, which will hopefully be soon, we'll then attend, and most of these kind of problems I'm talking about are probably problems that can be solved, but now's not the time. By the way, another thing that's very helpful in terms of managing this crisis and being used quite deftly, I can say, from what I'm seeing, is humor. Being able to laugh at the preposterousness of this. Now, humor is a tricky area to get into. Humor does not mean belittling the hardship and suffering of others, and humor should never be at somebody else's expense or at the expense of any subgroup of our population. But humor that sort of is universal, that captures the ludicrousness of the situation that we're in, we're all in together, is helpful, because it's in two respects. First of all, it feels better to laugh, and when we laugh, it reduces hardship, but also it also captures how outlandish this whole situation is. Let me see if I can just hold on, get a little more light on the subject now, and avoid this. Okay, I think this is better. Now, another issue that I want to talk about, and then I want to talk a little bit about grief during this, is the your sources of information, and how much information you access. Which is an important consideration in these times. The way we get news and information in recent years is very different than we had in the past. In the past, there would be a certain number of, call it newspapers, television channels, sources of information. Today, there's a bombardment of information through the internet and social media, where there's an abundant amount of information that we're being deluged. It's just coming in, it's flooding us. Now, this creates two situations. First of all, as I said, it's a lot of information, and because there's so many different types or different mediums, sources of information, they're competing for our attention. And because they compete for our attention, they're much more prone to have more sensationalist headlines, or to try to quickly report something that hasn't been verified yet. And one of the challenges of this situation is to learn how to manage the sources of information we have, because first of all, some more, let's call it sensationalist, or some sort of like headline breaking news can sometimes also be can be a source of anxiety, or even some, bold announcement of some sort of cure or some sort of preventative measure before it's been verified being publicized, and then that disappointment when it isn't helpful. So we have to learn how to manage the news. We have to know what sources we're using. There are news media that are more accurate and more reliable than others, and we have to familiarize ourselves with that. But even in terms of what's considered mainstream acceptable types of sources of information, we have to know how to look at it with the proverbial grain of salt. We have to look at it and take it, recognize that there's a whole different world in terms of how we're getting information, and also the amount. We have to avoid being news junkies, and be careful about news that pops up on our computers and it pops up on our phone. To filter it, or if it's causing us too much anxiety, to portion it out in sort of bite-sized portions. I see my time's coming close to the 40 minutes that I promised. So let me just say a few things about grief and loss. And unfortunately, we're all facing this. As I said, you have at work, and I'm so sorry to hear about that. But again, there are probably very few social circles or families that can identify people they know or people they love that have succumbed to this illness. And unfortunately, because of the social distancing and quarantining, we don't have the opportunity to have that outlet, such as wakes, shivas, funerals, even burials. We have to attend to them remotely, and we can't even pay our final respects, which is a real deprivation psychologically, as an opportunity for us to express our grief, or for that matter, to say goodbye to loved ones. So we are, in a way, deprived of so much of what's been traditionally ways in which we face tragedy of this magnitude. And we often wonder, many of us are wondering, in the field of mental health, will there be residual effects even when this is over, because of the aborted grieving that is taking place. But we have to try to do the best we can. And I would say that one way in which we can still preserve a very healthy way of grieving is to preserve the memory of the person. That social distancing and remote access cannot stop us from doing. And for those who have died, it's very, very important, even all the more important. It's important under optimal circumstances, but it's all the more important now to preserve the memory, to share stories, to talk about the person, to connect with each other, and make sure that those who died, even whether it's from COVID-19 or not, that those who die, especially now when we haven't been able to accord them the final respect that we'd like, is that their memory is preserved. That goes for your coworkers as well. And there are many ways to do this. It doesn't mean that you have to remember every single second you spend with them. But what made them special? How did they stick out? Stories or anecdotes, or just things they did that just made them unique and special. And by the way, this is also important if it's a coworker for the family members, because the family knows their loved one very well, but they don't know what they were like at work, and they don't know what they were like as a health provider, and you do. And if you contact the family and if you tell them what he or she was like at the work site, and with the unique contribution they made especially during this health crisis. That can be very meaningful to the family, and it can be a really tremendous source of solace. So again, those are some of the things that we can do. As I said before, this is unprecedented, and this is a stressor, and we can't make it good. What we're going to do is try to make it manageable, try to make it tolerable, and hopefully when this is over, we'll be all the better people as a result of it. So I'm going to stop here now because I want to leave some time for any questions. I don't see nobody's seen anything in the chat, but if you have a question, or if there's a comment you want to make, or if there's something that I didn't cover that you'd like me to address, I would invite you to unmute yourself and ask the question, and then I would ask you to remute yourself so background noise will not be disturbing. So I'm going to stop here and see if there's anybody who wants to ask something, and again, you have the chat option. If you want to be more private, you can privately send me a chat and with a question, and I'll address it without identifying who asked the question. So let me open up if anybody has anything they want to add or ask. Go ahead. I see somebody did.
Hi, this is
Dr.
Julius
Blumenthal. This is Barry Stern. I appreciate all your thoughts. I was hoping you would address perhaps what kind of relationships the staff should be sharing with the patients, and addressing that dynamic in terms of the fear that the patients have in the hospital, and how the staff should be coping with that themselves. Okay. and helping the patients cope.
Thank you. Very good. Let me just see what this person has to ask, and then I'll get to that. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, no, that person muted himself. Okay, or maybe it was a similar question. I think it's a wonderful...
This is Julius Durdick. I just had, I guess, a similar question on the other side. Now that we've heard, and this was really, truly, and thank you very much for a beautiful presentation, and it really gave us some insights. But we as staff working with others, what can we do, or are there any tips when people come to us to tell us how terrible they feel or how depressed they are? Any specifics, do's or don'ts that we should be doing with these folks?
Okay, good. So let me address both of them. So let me start first with the relationship with the patients. I'm sure under more optimal circumstances, I know for a fact from relatives who've been hospitalized and visiting people who are hospitalized, because sometimes I do professionally, that your role as care providers, as much as possible, is not just to address not only the medical needs, but their psychological well-being as well, to check in on them emotionally, how they're doing, or even sometimes to if you have the luxury to lend your ear to let them talk it out, their concerns that they may have. My sense from what's going on now is that people are so spread thin that sometimes comes at the expense of that provision, because there are life and death emergencies and of the sorts that you have to attend to. If that is the case, if someone is reaching out in a way, whether it's literally or figuratively, and we know, by the way, and I'm sure I'm stating the obvious to you, that the mind and body interact, and one's emotional well-being, or for that matter, one's hope, is integral to one's recovery, and that people who have realistic hope or are optimistic tend to do better, and we want to give them that. Again, we don't want to lie to patients, we want to give them that realistic hope, but sometimes you just simply can't. And if you can't, I think it's important if you acknowledge that. And I think you can say to the patient, I really wished I could spend more time to explaining to you, but because of the nature of the stress right now, I can't. Not because I'm running out to get a coffee, although sometimes you have to take care of yourself as well. You have to make sure you drink and eat and all that, but I'm not because I'm running to tell somebody a good joke. I simply can't, and if I have the chance, I'll try to come back. Validating for them that they have a legitimate concern and need will make it more possible, even if you can't spend time with them. In today's world also, and I think this is very important to know, we are much less inclined to hide things from people. We live in the age of information, and there's a more natural expectation that people are going to be told the truth, and sometimes the truth is painful. And people do, in my experience, for the most part, appreciate knowing the reality of a situation, even if it is not a positive one. Now, some people are not, and you have to sort of size up each patient. And you might have a patient who prefers to be more oblivious, in which case you have to respect their wishes. But it is important to be realistic and let them know. And again, not bludgeon them over the head with painful reality, but be realistic about what's happening with them. Now, the other thing that's extremely important is because not only do you as staff have limited time available for the patients, but they cut off from their family and loved ones. And this is, it's just unimaginable. It's just and how stressful that might be. And reminding the person, especially if you've had contact with the family, making sure the person at least knows that they have family who are very concerned. They have family that are thinking about them all the time, are praying for them, are checking in, are calling in as much as possible. It does, again, all we're doing is chipping away at the pain. And we'll take away from it. So it takes just a reminder and just to let them know, I know you can't talk to your children, your spouse, your parents, your siblings, but they're calling us and we're in touch with them, and you are on their mind. Is helpful and is health inducing. Like in all these situations, you sometimes have to know the person and what they need and what their particular preferences are, but those are, I think, important points. In terms of what do you do when patients come to you and talk about how depressed they are and how worried they are, and there's a lot of that. I've even heard from physicians, not verified, but I've heard from physicians, and in fact, I think I've even read a little bit about this, that they have a suspicion that this virus that we know so little about actually does even affect the central nervous system and the secretion of serotonin and dopamine, et cetera. So some of the worry and sadness is not only as a result of the situation, but actually might even be organically induced. And again, it's reality. They're not worrying, about their favorite team winning the World Series. There's some real worry here, and we don't have solutions. But you can never underestimate how important it is to listen and validate. I know it really is very depressing. It's very sad. And many of us are feeling that way, and other patients and other women that way. You're not the only one. Universalizing it, generalizing it, and listening and validating how they feel. You might think that might make them feel worse. For the most part, don't make it worse. Don't say, oh, you think that's bad. You should know this is bad. This person has it. That's not going to be helpful. But yes, it is sad. It is terrible. But God willing, hopefully, it's soon going to end. Something like that is a helpful comment. But we're doing a lot of that now. In a situation like this, we don't have solutions. We're validating people's pain and we're legitimizing it and being sympathetic. I'll mention one study, which I've quoted a lot, and I see there's a comment on the chat, and I'll get to that. But I don't think I've ever quoted a study as much as I've quoted this one in webinars I'm giving. But it's so relevant. They once took a bunch of college freshmen, I think it was in South Carolina, I don't remember, but they took a bunch of college freshmen. They gave them a few bucks to participate in the study. And what the study entailed was they took them to a very steep hill and they gave them a heavy backpack. And they said they want them to climb the hill. But before they climb the hill, they want them to estimate how hard it will be for them to climb the hill. So they have to rate how difficult it'll be for them to climb this hill. The only difference was one group climbed the hill alone and the other one climbed the hill with a friend. And pretty consistently, those who were about to climb the hill with a friend rated it as less difficult and challenging than those who had to climb it alone. And that's a lot of what we're doing for people nowadays. We're climbing the hill with them. And when we climb the hill with them, it just doesn't seem so steep. The hill's still there. And it's still a hard climb, but it's just not as hard when they're climbing it with someone else. I see there's a question in the chat. It's private. Okay, should we as a staff do something together to help the grieving process? Wonderful question. It's really something I should have said. Yes, when grief, interestingly enough, is an interpersonal experience. We don't grieve alone. One of the questions, sometimes you want to differentiate between whether somebody's depressed or they're grieving. And they're even though they look the same, they're very different states. And one of the differences is a person who's suffering from depression withdraws from human contact. The person who's grieving seeks out human contact. In fact, even consolation, I don't remember exactly, but if the word means doing something, con means together, reducing anguish together. It's something we do. So crying together. Unfortunately, we probably can't hug and like we used to, but crying together, talking together, sharing it does make it more tolerable. And it certainly would be, again, if it's a colleague, and you can even formally, again, do it again probably through Zoom, but formally get together for a commemorative meeting. And all you have to do is just share stories, and it even could be fun stories. I mean, sometimes you can share funny things the person did, or entertaining things the person did. It doesn't have to be anguish, but doing it together makes it more tolerable. And that was an excellent point, and I appreciate the person who brought that in. That was helpful. Have a few more minutes. Is there any of these matters that you want me to go into a little bit more, or other questions, or someone want to enter something on the chat? Okay. Okay, here's something from the chat. So let me, okay, so the question was, how should the staff express these feelings? We're talking about in terms of the grief, I assume. Should we set up a conference line? Yes, I think so. Again, sharing is so important. Forget even post-site grief, even the stress of the work. If you were to get together as a group, and by the way, you probably did that more naturally before there was a social distancing. When you had your breaks and you went to the staff lounge, and you had your lunch or your coffee, you probably spent time, talking about some of the stress and the pressure and the worries and et cetera. Obviously not at the same level that they are now, but we do that very naturally. We seek out others when we're stressed. I'll give you a simple example. I mean, it's something you may have experienced. Imagine you're on the subway. Again, normal times, everything's okay. And everybody has their earbuds in the ears, and everyone's reading and listening to music and doing their own thing. And suddenly the train screeches to a halt and the lights go off. What's the first thing you do? You're going to turn to somebody else. Next thing you know, we're all talking to each other. Because when we're in stress, we seek out the company of others. And if to do something like that, to have an opportunity, and again, without solutions, there don't have to be solutions, but an opportunity just to share with one another how hard it is. But I would also probably say acknowledge the great work that you're doing, because that's very important, would be, I'm sure, very helpful, and something we all have to do. It's interesting, there's an area in psychology called secondary trauma, or vicarious trauma, sometimes called compassion fatigue. I don't like that term. But it's the trauma of dealing with people who are traumatized. And it's very important that this gets talked out. I know our trauma team at Ohel, if somebody goes on a very difficult call to do a death notification, or following a suicide or a vehicular accident, and have to address the family, they have to meet with me or my counterpart afterwards, because these things catch up with me, and all we do is talk it out. We just talk it out. Okay. Also, is it better to do it one-on-one or as a group? That's a good question. And I think that depends how overlapping the experience is. So if you have a very unique role in the setting that has its own unique stressors, suppose you're trying to balance the budget. You're not doing actual healthcare, but you're in the financial office, and of course things are financially very difficult nowadays, and it's creating a certain stress. And so it's a different type of stress than the physician, nurse, or the health provider. So then it may make more sense to do it one-on-one. But if it's shared and among a larger group, the more people you share it with, the more validated you feel. The more that there is a comfort in knowing you're not the only one. It's an interesting thing. Some of the research on natural disasters show that those, in some respects, are easier because it's shared by a community. For example, we went out to Malibu after the fires. The fact that almost significant portions of the community were affected by fires in a way made it easier than if it had been a fire in a single home. So therefore, if there's enough overlap in the experience, and it can be done in a larger group, then probably the larger group would be better. Anything else? Let me just look again. Am I forgetting? I'll give people a minute or two if they want to write something on a chat. Okay, so far I see nothing, and our time is close to up. Oh, here's something. Okay, good. Let me hear what the. Okay. Okay. In your experience, how does PTSD in regard to the future? Okay, very good question. Let me address that issue. Okay, we have to differentiate, by the way, and this is a misconception. I have to, to some extent, blame the media for that. The difference between a post-traumatic reaction and PTSD. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. The D is a very important letter in that because that means that the trauma was such that you can't function afterwards. In other words, that when all this will be over, you can't get up in the morning, or you're fighting with family members, or you're not attending to your health, or something like that, where there's a real dysfunction, which happens. There is such a thing as PTSD. PTSD, the highest rates seem to occur, and we don't know what the outcome from this will be, but for soldiers who were repeatedly traumatized in combat situations. Isolated traumatic events, like a single traumatic event, can result in PTSD, but not that commonly. And in fact, most people do not get PTSD. That's the common misconception. Again, the D, meaning a disorder. However, a post-traumatic reaction, in other words, where it's impacting on you and maybe even compromising your function, but you're able to function. So you might not be sleeping well at night, but you get up in the morning and go to work, or you might be a little more short-tempered with the kids, but you're still, for the most part, managing them. That's more common, and there will be post-traumatic reactions. And the interesting thing about it is that it is post. In other words, the reaction does occur when the stress and trauma is over. So that's why it's an excellent question, because many of us are speculating, or at least acknowledging that when all this is over, they're going to find a vaccine or a cure, and this will be all over. We're not just going to wipe our brow and go back to being the way we are. It's going to have a lingering effect. We're not going to be the same, because much of the emotional turmoil, and especially for those of you, again, who are on the front, is reserved and not expressed now because you can't, because you have to have your wits about you. And when things get back to normal, we'll hit you. A very good example of that is what we see with survivors of residential fires. I don't know if anybody ever did. I hope not. But let's say there was a fire. Let's say everybody got out. There wasn't even any fatalities. But if you know anybody who had a fire, you lost everything. You don't have a shred of clothing. You don't have your documents. You don't have your pictures. And then you have to find some place to live and deal with insurance adjusters and all that. And then about a year later, you got all your documents back. You go with your new wardrobe. You have a brand new house built. And that's sometimes when the nightmares and some of the reactions come, because before that, you're too busy trying to get your life together. Most of us right now are too busy to allow the full emotional impact to sink in. And it will probably be some residual effects. There will probably be some fallout. To predict is very hard. I like to quote the great philosopher Yogi Berra, who says that prognosticating is very difficult, especially about the future. We don't know, but I think we all feel pretty certain that there will be, residual effects, maybe some anger, frustration, worry about the future. Maybe people are going to be, in general, much more cautious about close contact, which is going to be very hard. It's going to have a very big impact in congested cities like New York, where we're so used to really being on top of each other. There will be some residual effect. There may even be, by the way, and that's something we can't rule out either, maybe that's a good way to sort of conclude, is there may be positive effects as well. There is post-traumatic resilience. There's post-traumatic growth. It's interesting, after 9/11, there was some staggering data of how many people who survived the 9/11 tragedy in the World Trade Center, who actually described ways in which they enhanced their lives, enhanced relationships, tried to find more meaning in their life, became productive in new ways. So we may come out of this to some extent injured, but to some extent improved and enhanced. So I hope it's mostly the latter, but it's very hard. I think we have to brace ourselves for reactions and for it's a fallout or growth as a result. But I don't know if we can actually predict which one it would be. Would you recommend doing something for the frontline staff when they're positive agreement? Okay, so again, so the question is, should we do something for frontline staff when a patient dies during COVID? And that's an interesting question, because one of the things that I have heard, particularly from healthcare providers who are in a setting where there is a lot of death, in units where patients are sent when they fully anticipate death, or in oncology units, et cetera, that there is a grieving process. Interesting thing that I have heard from health providers is that sometimes there'll be multiple deaths and they don't have, and then there'll be one person, they're usually someone particularly endearing, or maybe somebody whom they really thought was on the mend, and that person dies, and all the cumulative emotions from all the other deaths catch up with them. And I think, yes, the tricky thing with this, I mean, I mentioned earlier, is secondary trauma. What makes that so difficult is you don't see it coming. In other words, if God forbid you have a loved one who's dying and they're getting worse and worse, and you're bracing yourself when they're going to die, at least you know it's going to come, and you're, even as painful as it does, you're ready for it. But when you're in a unit, you're manning an inner city emergency room, where you're just seeing one after the other sick, dying, or you know they're not going to make it, and grieving parents, but you don't have the luxury to attend to the emotions. You got to run from one to the other. It sneaks up on you, and it'll be the 10th or 15th one that'll get to you. So if you can, and if you have the opportunity to process it, if you have an opportunity to process it, it means all the stuff that we talked about, talking it out, doing, again, besides that, but with staff, talking about it, crying, expressing your anguish and your frustration and your perceived helplessness, that'll help. And that's something that should be, as much as possible. Again, I'm very generous with other people's time, and I know how overextended most facilities are, but if there is that chance, if that opportunity, if that can be worked into your day, it would be very important, because otherwise it sneaks up on you and then blindsides you. And that can be very harmful. I think our time is up. I want to make it clear, I'm available, and my team is available to those who have more specific issues. Mr. Stern knows how to reach us. Also, there's the Ohel website. You can, Ohel Children's Home and Family Services, which we can help can be accessed through this, even through this Ohel TheraZoom that we're using. And we have a team of trained trauma specialists who can make themselves available. And if necessary, I can make myself available. Again, I would use Mr. Stern or other administrative sources as a conduit to reach me if it's necessary, but we're here as much as can. And again, I extend, the work you do is noble and heroic, and I humbly acknowledge that on the part of everybody. And thank you as much for all your efforts. And if there's some way that we can reciprocate, we're more than happy to do so. Okay, Mr. Stern, anything else to add?
Yeah, I really appreciate all your kind words, and I think everybody needs to be prepared to cope with this situation, and you've given us some tools. So thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And we'll have the recording available in a day or two, so those who missed it and want to listen, that'll be available.
Right, and we have a flyer going around, Dr. Blumenthal, that we'll make known to the staff, some resources available. Both for the 1199 member assistance program and Aetna, and the Ohel resources. I'm sure will be good to distribute as well. But thank you so much.
My pleasure, and everybody should be well, and this hopefully will end soon. Okay, take care. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Bye bye.